Tao Meeting Archives, October 4th, 2015. When the World Has the Tao, by Bill Bunting.
What say we go ahead with the meeting beginning ritual?
Please do.
Alrighty. 起立，面向佛堂，参加三鞠躬，一鞠躬，再鞠躬，三鞠躬，参加多一点三十一鞠躬，开竿一鞠躬，请坐下。
And welcome everybody to this Sunday's online study group. It is a beautiful, beautiful, cool, sunny day in Indianapolis. The leaves are starting to turn, but it's not quite winter yet, thank goodness. But it is beautiful to watch the seasons change. I hope all of you are having a wonderful morning or afternoon or evening in whatever time zone you may be. This discussion this morning has to do with chapter 46 from the Tao Te Ching. It's a chapter that we talk about off and on with some frequency, and I'm still hoping to garner some insight from this chapter that perhaps we haven't quite said this way before or looked at maybe quite this way before. It's a chapter that I go back to fairly frequently. I have maybe, I don't know, 6 or 8 chapters that are, some real favorites. Chapters that kind of speak to me in my own journey down the path. This is one of them, and I spend quite a bit of time contemplating the variations in human nature that made and continue to make this teaching necessary. Chapter 46 says, when the world has the Tao, fast horses are retired to till the soil. When the world lacks the Tao, war horses give birth on the battlefield. There is no crime greater than greed, no disaster greater than discontentment, no fault greater tn avarice. Thus, the satisfaction of contentment is the lasting satisfaction. When I first started studying the Tao teachings, I had a really hard time trying to make an association between these two sections of chapter 46. And over time, both in studying and listening to Derek and contemplating what this says, I've had the opportunity to consider what this really means at a number of different angles and from a variety of different perspectives. What we're really talking about here in essence is the difference between farming and warfare, between peacetime and wartime, between the utilization of resources in times of conflict and in times of peace. And so Lao Tzu speaks to a couple of things that his contemporaries would have known really well at the time, 2,500 years ago or so. And he says that when the world has the Tao, when the way of peace prevails, if you will, when the teachings are pervasive in the land, the fast horses are retired to till the soil. Their work is easy. Their lives are relatively comfortable, and they're relegated to assisting mankind in the raising of food. And then it goes on to say that when the world lacks the Tao, when the teachings are not pervasive in the land, when the people ignore the truths of the Tao teachings, that war horses give birth on the battlefield. This is perhaps one of the most mistranslated chapters in the entire Tao Te Ching, and there are a variety of representations of chapter 46, if you will, some of which go so far as to speak about trucks and warheads and things like that didn't exist in Lao Tzu's time. And I think those interpretations do a disservice to this chapter because of the picture they paint. This is a very specific image of the difference between what happens when people walk a path of peace and when they do not. And the primary difference between those two times really has nothing to do with either peacetime or wartime. It has everything to do with the mindset of the sovereign. In Lao Tzu's illustration, one of the things that we should figure out fairly rapidly is that countries and governments go to war for a variety of reasons. And one of those reasons is to acquire land and resources. In World War II, Japan invaded huge parts of China and the Indo-Chinese Peninsula in a quest for those very things, land and resources. They were an island nation. They didn't have an abundance of raw materials with which to build a war machine. They needed to find those resources from somewhere, and that began an imperialistic campaign on their part to go get those resources in that land. The Germans in World War II used the concept of Lebensraum, which means essentially living space, as an excuse to invade the Sudetenland in Austria and other parts of Europe. So there's a precedent in modern history for what Lao Tzu is speaking of, and of course during the Warring States period in China, there was infighting between the various and sundry warlords prior to the unification of the country, also over land and resources. Well, people do the same sorts of things, not perhaps in the same way. And so I kind of ask the question here, what is it that we're prepared to go to war over? What are we prepared to fight to have? And on its face, I think a lot of people might answer that question with nothing. Unfortunately, when we examine our own human nature, that's not the truth. We spend a healthy part of our lives scratching and clawing and fighting our way up that corporate ladder to try and acquire a decent living for ourselves and our families, to try and get that new Corvette or that bigger house or that in-ground swimming pool or whatever it is that we think is going to make us happy. And sometimes we're prone to disregard the effects of our actions and words on other people while we're in the process of doing that. It is a fundamental part of our nature to want to live well. And by living well in this particular case, I'm talking about a comfortable secular life. We'll delve into the more spiritual side of things here momentarily. Lao Tzu says there's no greater crime than greed, and no disaster greater than discontentment. This is not the only time in the Tao Te Ching that Lao Tzu speaks of knowing contentment and achieving contentment in our lives. That is, to be fundamentally emotionally okay with where we are, with our lot in life, with what we have, with where we're going, with what we're doing. I think one of the huge reasons for that is that discontentment by itself fuels greed. And greed is a slippery slope that leads us away from the teachings of the Tao and into a huge black hole that we can't ever crawl out of. In its most extreme form, in its worst expression, greed becomes avarice. If you look at the Webster's dictionary definitions for greed and for avarice, avarice is defined as an extreme form of greed, an insatiable desire to acquire or have more wealth or more power or both. And so it becomes fairly easy at that point to see why Lao Tzu would say that there is no disaster greater than discontentment and no fault greater than avarice. Greed, as it turns out, is something of an emotion. It's the emotional state that is admonished against in the Ten Commandments when Moses says, "Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's goods," and there's a whole list of stuff that we are commanded not to covet. That is an admonition against greed and against avarice. Because while greed is something of an emotional condition, avarice is a choice. Avarice is the extreme expression of greed, the inability to stop both wanting and acquiring more of whatever it is we're acquiring, irregardless of the cost to us in terms of our not only our secular lives, but our spiritual selves as well. And Lao Tzu doesn't mince words in his teaching about greed and avarice. I think it's pretty easy to infer that Lao Tzu considered these two things to be so disastrous, so catastrophically bad for a human being, that he directly says, you know, these are the worst things that can happen to you. Then he goes on to say that the satisfaction of contentment is the lasting satisfaction. In reading through these few lines, what does it say about our essential human nature that Lao Tzu finds it necessary to lecture us on something that you would think one would know in their heart? It calls into question what we consider to be the source of our fulfillment. And I believe with all of my heart that from the earliest times that human beings set foot on this planet and were able to consider that their next door neighbor in the cave down the street had more rocks than they did, the ability to acquire more or better of something than our neighbor had. I think that's gone on in human societies from the very beginning, and it still goes on to this day. We spend an inordinate amount of time very frequently trying to acquire the stuff that we believe will make us happy. And what we find out is that when we acquire the in-ground pool, the bigger house, the Corvette, whatever it is, that for some reason that latest trinket or toy doesn't quite seem to fill up that hole. There's always something else that we just can't live without, and so the chase continues. Maybe we need to add that fourth bathroom, or make the in-ground pool a little bigger, or trade the Corvette in on a Porsche. Whatever it is, we seem to be driven to have more of it and have it be better than anybody else on the street. I have an uncle who lives out in Mesa, Arizona. And I went out to visit him some years ago, and he made a point of lecturing me for probably 20 minutes on the fact that his in-ground swimming pool was a full 2 feet longer than anybody else's swimming pool on his block. Where I come from here in Indiana, in-ground pools are a real luxury item, because for several months out of the year you can't swim in them. In the winter months they have to be winterized and pretty much drained. Otherwise, the winter turns the pool into a skating rink, and it destroys the cement and tile work and everything else involved in putting one in. It is a black hole for income and pool chemicals that you use for 2 or 3 months out of the year. In this community in Mesa, Arizona, there was virtually not a house anywhere that didn't have an in-ground pool. But at least out there for 9 months out of the year or so, you can swim in it. I can remember over the years, and when I think about this, I still wonder what the big doggone deal was that his pool was 2 feet longer than anybody else's. What did that extra 2 feet do for him? Other than take away 2 feet of some really nasty looking kind of brownish grass that nobody had to mow anyway. It's a desert out there. Having a lawn is a luxury out there. There's not enough water to keep it green. That's the mindset that I'm talking about. The mindset that doesn't know how much is enough. The mindset that feeds the ego's need to be bigger, better, more, newer, faster, or something, to keep up with the Joneses, and if at all possible, to bypass them handily and beat them at the game of whoever dies with the most toys wins. That mindset in our society leads to the ruination of people. When we place the stuff that we want to acquire ahead of feeding the spirit and helping our fellow man, we live in a reality that is horribly skewed, and we become blinded and jaded to what's really important in life. The reason that Lao Tzu speaks about the times of war and the times of peace is because the people he was writing to could probably each and every one readily visualize the horrors of one situation and the blessings of the other. That came down to basic survival needs. It's impossible to farm a field that has an army camped out in the middle of it. If an emissary of the emperor comes by and conscripts 2/3 of the males to serve in the army, then the community lacks the strength to maintain the farms and maintain the animals. In times of war back then, starvation followed on the heels of the conflict. It was a hard time all the way around. In our society, we don't face those kinds of immediately severe consequences. But don't think for a second that because our bodies aren't starving, our spirits are healthy. Greed and avarice starve the spirit just as surely as the absence of food starves the body. And that's what Lao Tzu was talking about. It's unthinkable to me to deprive anyone of sustenance, physically or spiritually, either one, simply so that I can have a new jet ski. Don't know what I'd do with it anyway. Most likely, given my history with power tools, I'd fall off of it and drown, but that's a whole nother discussion. The ego self that drives that desire, the covetousness, the greed, the avarice, never knows when to stop. It doesn't understand contentment and fulfillment. It doesn't understand that there is a huge difference between what we need and perhaps what we want. or what we think we need. It's what makes avarice the greatest disaster. Discontentment and avarice go together to completely and utterly ruin a human being from the inside out. And when we're stuck in the middle of being ruined, it's very hard to see that we are perhaps the definition of insane. When compassion and caring for other people and the limits of reasonableness go out the window, we become a pretty hollow shell of what is supposed to be a spiritual being working their way back home. You don't have to look real far to find an individual. I've been there. Some of you have been as well, I am quite sure, that has that great empty hole in their hearts where we think that if only we can make more money, get a bigger house, get a better car, get something else, that our wife will stay with us longer and our kids will love us more, and people will look up to us, or we'll be famous or great or something else. And yet we continue to discover that there is no filling that hole up with stuff. The only way to fill that great empty hole is through giving. And so if one wishes to be a farmer and not a warrior or a victim of the warfare as it goes through our little patches of farmland, there's a method. Not one that's even unknown. It's pretty simple, fairly straightforward, and talked about fairly frequently. First of all, we have to learn how much is enough. We have to learn not to confuse what we think we need with what we really need. We have to take care of the things that are required to be taken care of before we can take care of the things we want to take care of. We can't utilize waste and greed and the acquisition of wealth and power to try to leverage spiritual evolution. It just doesn't work that way. But when we move even a little bit of our resources into that service to others, into giving freely from an open heart without attachments, the most miraculous things happen. The first one is that we learn not to succumb to greed and avarice. It may be kind of scary at first. The Tao of Giving is it's a wonderful teaching, but it requires us to do perhaps sometimes what we are disinclined to do, and that's to give of ourselves and what we have with absolutely no expectation of return whatsoever. I don't know about all of you guys, but despite the fact that my wife and I do really well professionally, there are always 1,000 more places to spend our money than we have money to spend. I suspect very strongly it's always that way. And yet, we find it in our hearts to support the charitable work and giving that we feel is important. And ever since we started doing it, particularly since I started down the path I'm on now, my family has never suffered or wanted for anything they've ever needed. Now, it is true we have not had everything we've ever wanted, but we've had everything we ever needed. And we're pretty doggone comfortable. I don't have any complaints. To learn to give with an open heart and receive with gratitude is one of the most difficult lessons in all of human nature to learn. It is our ego that tells us that giving without an expectation of receiving is foolishness. That giving should be a transaction, that we should receive something for the money we spend, for the service we render. And that's just plain not always the case. For a person who does not know how to give without attachments and agendas, every transaction is a battle. Every goal is a battlefield. And every act of giving comes with strings attached to it that prevent the giving from benefiting the recipient or the giver, either one. It's that mindset that Lao Tzu was attempting to identify and help people to mitigate. Because it is only through the elimination of the personal agendas and the strings that we can understand the joys of both giving and receiving. We have to learn how to be content with our lot in life. The definition of insanity is trying the same actions over and over and over again and expecting a different outcome. And yet the world is full of people who do exactly that very thing. By trying to acquire enough stuff to fill up that hole in their heart. It's a pointless exercise because that hole is not filled up with stuff. It's filled up with Tao. Contentment is the beginning of that evolution, of that realization, of that understanding, of the knowledge that for as long as we follow the teachings and practice them in a manner that they were meant to be applied, that we will not suffer unduly, and that even though misfortune is going to land on us every now and again, it isn't going to last forever, and we're not going to starve to death as a result. The other thing that's important to realize is that learning to be content doesn't mean living in poverty and want. I have never understood the philosophy of organizations that say that giving until it hurts and living right on the cusp of crushing poverty in some way makes us more spiritually refined and capable of receiving the blessings of heaven. If the teachings don't help us to better our lives in the here and now, why are we practicing them? And yet, in Indiana and all over the Deep South, you can drive past churches where the parking lots are full of 1973 Pintos, and the people are just as poor as they can possibly be. I'm not even going to try to comment on all of the causative factors, but I've been involved enough in a lot of Judeo-Christian theology and education to know that in many of those organizations, living close to the edge of starvation is rewarded as being spiritually refined, as building up treasure in heaven. I don't get it. I don't necessarily need to live in the governor's mansion to be content and happy. But I'd certainly like to live in something that's a little better than a shack with no windows and no heat. It is not wrong or impractical or a violation of the teachings to provide a very good and adequate living for our families. The example, at least for those of you in Los Angeles, is there every Sunday. The ordained masters have great lives. They have wonderful lives. They have blessed lives. They are all very comfortable in their secular lives and remarkably refined in their spiritual lives. They support the work of the temples out of their own pockets and still have a life that would be a subject of some envy by many people. I'm still struggling to get there. I have owned and lost 2 businesses trying to do that very thing. And all that means is I haven't quite learned the lessons yet. But don't worry, I'm not giving up. I'll absolutely get it one of these days, and when I do, I'll share how with all of you. I'm running just a tad over, and I apologize. But the summary is fairly brief. You know, it can be difficult, particularly if we don't spend some time contemplating on this chapter and studying it to understand it well, to associate the 2 different parts of chapter 46. It's tough to make that into a cohesive life lesson because the symbolism is a bit difficult to personalize, particularly if you're reading about trucks and warheads and that sort of thing. Those things just plain didn't exist 2,500 years ago. And so the mistranslations and disinformation that are available tend to obfuscate the lesson contained in the writings. But it's not impossible to understand at a very deep level, and more importantly, rather than just rationally understanding it, it isn't terribly difficult to incorporate into our lives and actually utilize, which was kind of the intent behind writing it to begin with. Just like with so many other teachings, it is, you know, the sovereign of a country who makes the decision whether or not the country goes to war. It's a human being, it's a person who decides the fate of the horses in part 1 of chapter 46. The horse doesn't decide to go declare war on the neighboring state. The government does. In a very real and very tangible sense, we are that same sovereign. We decide the fate of our own situation. We decide whether or not we're willing to go to war, whether we're willing to tear up the nicely tilled fields of our lives to go acquire something that we don't need, to feed the ego and succumb to greed and to avarice, to let discontentment destroy our lives and our homes. We get to make that decision. And the wonderful thing with the Tao teachings is that if we make the wrong choice and we live to take breath tomorrow, we can change that decision. In this particular case, we can wake up tomorrow morning and say, I'm not going to go to war today over this. I'm going to put it down. I'm going to find a different way. I did that. I know other people that have done it. It benefited my life 1,000 times over to do it. And while I don't have it all right yet, the parts that I do have right have been pretty doggone beneficial. And so, yeah, I speak with a lot of authority and passion on this topic because I've applied the teachings and I know what they do. I keep saying that the results of these teachings are reproducible nearly 100% of the time using the scientific method. If you do what the teachings say to do in the way that they say to do it, they work the same way every time without fail. There are precious few things in our lives that are that reproducibly valid and concurrently that beneficial for us. And so, you know, when I say that, that means this is a real boon to us in terms of our spiritual refinement and improving our lives in the here and now. And so the question becomes, you know, are we prepared to go to war to acquire more stuff? Or are we going to learn the lesson of contentment and retire our war horses to go till another field somewhere? Are we going to walk a path of peace? Or are we going to keep chasing the stuff that we think we need? It's always a choice. Always. And we can always choose wisely. Thank you all very much for letting me share with you. I do truly enjoy doing this, and I hope this was helpful for someone.
Bill, thank you. I want to share with you that I'll be getting into 44, chapter 44 today. You spoke of 46. There are definitely some themes, some threads that are weaving in and out of these various chapters from the Tao Te Ching. So 2 lines particularly stand out for me in 44 that find an echo in what you're talking about today. So from 44, it says, knowing contentment avoids disgrace. Knowing when to stop avoids danger. So contentment, knowing when to stop, how the ego has an effect in the opposite direction, causing us to forget when to stop. I think these are very interesting points that you have made today as well.
Thank you. And yes, I read through 44 this morning, just kind of perusing through the chapters before we got together.
Excellent, excellent. So question for you, Bill. Is your premise that war is equivalent to greed or avarice?
No, that's not what Lao Tzu is saying. It's illustrative. Lao Tzu painted a picture 2,500 years ago of the effects of warfare and farming that people could wrap their heads around and understand very, very readily. But he goes beyond the illustration of warfare and farming to an understanding of how greed and avarice can create the conditions of warfare in countries, and then by inference, what those philosophies of greed and avarice can do in the lives of the people. War doesn't necessarily create greed and avarice, but war absolutely can be caused by individuals who are utilizing greed and avarice in their ego-filled lives. Once again, land and resources, are a common excuse to go to war. And those things typically are born of greed, of a misplaced need to have something that one doesn't currently have.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So the other possibility too is that, on one side of the coin, it is the acquisition of additional land and or resources. And, land can be resources. The other side of the coin is a perceived threat to land and or resources, like a survival issue. Like a preemptive strike, defensive posture type of thing.
Sure, absolutely.
Let's do the meeting ending ritual. 起立，面向佛堂，持架3鞠躬，一鞠躬，再鞠躬，3鞠躬，持架各位点成是1鞠躬，接班1鞠躬。Hey, we're done, everybody. Thanks so much.
Join the Tao meeting live to participate in the questions and commentary. For more information, go to http://taoism.net/tao/connect-online.